quite a while, I was interested in maybe developing a little talk about Goosetown, but I didn't know really anything about Goosetown, and I know something more about it now, so I'd like to share that with you. But it's an area of town that is a little bit mysterious in a way. There's not much written about it. I've looked in all the old newspapers, and there's not much there. They refer to Goosetown to some degree. Usually it's just something that's a historical thing by Weber or somebody like that. But I did find one wonderful source for my material for Goosetown, and you will hear me talking about the author repeatedly throughout to cite her work. So I'm going to tell you what I've learned about Goosetown. If any of you are new to Iowa City, you may not have even heard about Goosetown. Goosetown was not a town at all, of course, but a section of Iowa City that was settled in the mid-1900s. It was settled principally by Bohemian and German peoples, those two ethnic groups. This image was taken from Mary Beth Sloniger's book, Small But Ours. The caption in the book reads, "The only known photo of geese taken in Goosetown." That seems a little bit improbable, but that's how she stated that. So this image serves as our introduction to the area of town which derived its name from the practice of raising geese by its citizens. Small But Ours was published in 1999 and contains some wonderful history of Goosetown and its rich and personal stories of its early inhabitants. Mary Beth spent a long time, perhaps 5 to 10 years, interviewing residents. And at that time, there were still some people there who had memories of their grandparents, perhaps, and beyond, who related stories about Goosetown. So she was able to capture a lot of stuff and has put this book out. The people who settled this area in town were not the first people to inhabit Iowa City. Iowa City was founded in 1839, and the first settlers were largely native-born Americans who came from the eastern United States. A large percentage of them were from Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and New York. And as far as the name Goosetown, the person or persons who coined the name is unknown, and the name is not unique to Iowa City. For example, the Goosetown neighborhood exists in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and that may well have been named also for the geese that were kept there. There's also a Goosetown in Akron, Ohio, maybe more. Now, the area of Goosetown, it's subject to debate. This is Sloniger's, and you'll hear me refer to her a lot. This is her concept of the area encompassed by Goosetown. She considers the western boundary to be about the east edge of North Dodge Street. So picture where the Ace Hardware store is, going by St. Wenceslaus Church on the right as you go south. She considers that, okay. And also the eastern edge is Reno Street. And I was always curious about how did we get the name Reno Street, and I found something about that I'll relate. And Brown Street to the north, and Bloomington Street as the northern and southern limits, Brown and Bloomington. So here is Sloniger's Goosetown within the greater area of today's Iowa City. You can take a moment and look at that. Weber, however, believed that a much narrower area defined the Goosetown neighborhood. Irving Weber, our historian. Church Street on the north, Market Street to the south, Reno on the east edge, and Lucas Street defining the western boundary. So here I'll show you the two representations together. Irving Weber was a lifelong Iowa Citian, and he began writing about Iowa City history when he was 72 years old. He died at age 96 in the year 1997. He left us with a wealth of information concerning local history. So again, here I show both Sloniger's and Weber's areas of Goosetown. This image shows Weber's Goosetown on an 1854 map, and that's just about the time when the first residents settled in Goosetown. Goosetown was on the eastern edge of town, and Reno and Center Streets were not yet established. This is about the time, like I say, when the first immigrants arrived in the Goosetown neighborhood. Even by 1870, Goosetown was at the eastern city limits. And here's one I want to study for a bit. Looking at this aerial view of Iowa City, probably from 1951, very close to the year 1951. There is very little development east of Goosetown. So Goosetown, here's, if you can see my revolving pointer here, where I show Bloomington Street, Goosetown, there's really nothing east of there other than rural areas, farms. City High is shown here, and the VA hospital here in the lower left was built in 1951, had its first patient in March of 1952. And also I know that this would probably be 51 or 52 because there was no Bel Air edition yet, which came in 1953. And that was just north of City High, right in here. Attributions to Goosetown are situated atop many of the neighborhood streets. Weber said, all agree that East Bloomington Street certainly was the heart of Goosetown. So again, in preparing this presentation, I drew largely from Mary Beth Sloniger's research. I also consulted Irving Weber's writings and used the archives of the Iowa City Press Citizen, which, as I said, did not reveal too much. And finally, I drove and walked through Goosetown with my camera in hand. Weber wrote that with the wave of migration helped along by the arrival of the railroad, which was in 1855 here, or the beginning of 1856, 4 ethnic groups began settling here. And 2 of these groups settled in the Goosetown area. The Bohemians were probably the largest group, and they chose rural sections north of Iowa City in addition to the area that would become known as Goosetown. So who were the Bohemians? Where is Bohemia? The country most of us remember as Czechoslovakia was established after World War I in 1918 and remained intact until January of 1993. So here we have the limits of Czechoslovakia. We see within it Slovakia, Moravia, and Bohemia. When the country was dissolved in 1993 and separated into the Czech Republic to the west and Slovakia to the east, Bohemia is the western portion of the Czech Republic. So that puts you into the geography of Bohemia. In the mid-1800s, the Austrian Empire ruled over Bohemia. But in 1848 and 1849, a set of revolutions took place that led to a migration of Bohemian people, with many coming to America. To quote Mary Beth Sloniger, quote, just as people were leaving Bohemia to escape the effect of the 1848 revolution and succeeding wars in the Habsburg Empire, they were traveling to a country whose political situation was rapidly deteriorating into civil war. Immigrants had to make the emotional shift from fleeing military service to volunteering for military service. So here are the sections of the Czech Republic. According to Sloniger, quote, the majority of Goosetowners traveled from the western region of Bohemia, many from the district of Pilsen. Pilsen is over here. The city of Pilsen is known worldwide for the origin of Pilsner beer, which was created in the 1840s. Sloniger wrote of one immigrant family from Prague. Their sailboat, which afforded them cheaper passage than a steamboat, took over 3 months to cross the Atlantic. Their baby boy, born at sea, did not survive the trip and was buried at sea. The family traveled down the St. Lawrence River, crossed the Great Lakes, and arrived at Detroit. They sold some of their meager possessions to raise enough money to make it to Iowa. Mm-hmm. In the proposed National Register nomination for the Goosetown Historic District, we find this statement. Although of limited means, The Czechs by 1900 had the largest percentage of freehold home ownership, 65%, when compared both to other foreign-born groups as well as to the native-born population. A second group of immigrants came from Germany, which was not united as Germany in those days. And these people comprised the second largest immigrant group in Johnson County.
How can I get a voice here?
Many of these Germans settled in Goosetown. Concerning Iowa as a whole, Germans comprised the largest foreign-born group. From the earliest years, the Germans and Bohemians became allied through marriage. And the third and fourth immigrant groups were the Irish and the Welsh, people who did not settle in Goosetown. Many of the Irish left their native land because of the potato famine in the late 1840s. And now my word about Reno Street. Weber thought Reno Street was named for Charles Reno, who was a 5-term mayor of Iowa City and the head of the very successful Reno real estate agency. Another person thought Reno Street was named for his grandfather, Morgan Reno, territorial treasurer of Iowa, and the first state treasurer when the capital was moved to Des Moines. The Bohemian settlers preserved many of their old world customs, including the teaching of the language to their children. Many or most of the residents kept geese, which were raised for food and for feathers for feather beds, down comforters, and down pillows. The geese wandered about over the unpaved streets by day, but when night came, they knew where home was. The flocks of geese were often tended by young boys and girls. A former resident of Goosetown, Ed Sybil, recalled that in addition to saving goose feathers, the last tip of the wing was cut for a whisk broom, and some of the longer primary feathers were saved and used to brush butter on bread and rolls. And if the quills were good enough, they were used to make pens that were dipped in ink. Goose grease was even used to rub on a person's chest for a cold. This kind of reminds me of the pork processing plants in Chicago that used everything but the squeal. Feather stripping bees, like spelling bees, were held as social events for ladies. The feathers plucked from geese had to be stripped from the quill before the down could be used for feather beds and pillows. This was tedious work, but by making the process into a bee, the ladies could enjoy the work. Bohemian families celebrated Thanksgiving, Christmas, and a special Bohemian holiday called Poswatana with meals of roast goose. Again, to quote Sloniger, the question has been asked about when the geese disappeared from Goosetown. Geese need pasturage, so as the Goosetown neighborhood became populated, grazing areas disappeared. It was at this time that geese were replaced by chickens and ducks, until a city ordinance restricted the raising of all fowl in city yards. In the mid-1850s, the land of Goosetown was a mixture of prairie and hardwood forest, conditions that apparently attracted the Bohemians to the area. Goosetown traditionally exhibited small-scale homes, often near the front lot lines, with side yards and backyards. In early Goosetown, there were double-sized lots, complete with barns, coops, and pens, smokehouses, summer kitchens, large vegetable gardens, and of course outhouses. Properties typically had fenced-in yards, pumps, and cisterns, and later tin roofs. A wide variety of crops were grown, including cabbage, corn, potatoes, beets, squash, pumpkins, cucumbers, tomatoes, carrots, parsnips, turnips, radishes, lettuce, melons, and peas. And fruit trees were abundant. Some people even raised tobacco. The residents were frugal, often without much money, so they harvested crops to supplement their income. And most families kept a cow and raised 2 hogs each year. The hogs were butchered on their property and cured for usage in the winter months. The founding family of Goosetown was considered to be the Jaworskis, since they owned lots on Bloomington Street at the very early date of 1856. This is a view I took just last week of the two Yavorsky sister houses, and they are in the 700 block of Bloomington Street on the north side. And here's another cottage on the same block. A few early brick homes can be found in Goosetown. There were 3 brickyards in the Goosetown area: Gollichers, Gosses, and Boards. One of them likely provided the bricks for this house. Most of us know this building. An organization called the Czechoslovakian Association was formed to support the welfare of Czech and Slovak immigrants, and it actually began as an insurance services organization. And in 1900, this meeting hall, situated west of the Horace Mann Elementary School, was built. Bohumil Šimik, whom I'll refer to later, was the chairman of the building committee. In the fall of 1974, William and Doris Prusel bought this Czechoslovakian hall and proceeded to restore it for their School of Music. Well, as children grew up and married, they often stayed in the neighborhood, building slightly larger cottages. Sloniger suggested that by perhaps the 1920s or 30s, the name Goosetown gradually fell into disuse. But families with long standing in the community never forgot this name, which began with a negative connotation and changed it to a title of endearment, worn proudly in the neighborhood today, which was 1999 when Sloniger's book was published. Childhood was over for Goosetown boys at the age of 16 when they entered the workforce, according to her. By far the most common way for a young girl to earn money was to work as a domestic. In addition, such places as the Maine Jewelry Factory, now Chaddock Green, and the Ray Glove Factory employed a lot of women. Sloniger related that it took about 3 generations to lose the Bohemian language. She said the Alberhasky family spoke only Bohemian, and their oldest son never learned English, but the younger ones did. And by the time the grandchildren were listening to relatives and friends telling stories, the kids could not understand a word. Now we'll talk about religious life in Goosetown. In 1843, the Schlenk family was one of the first German ones to arrive in Iowa City. They were from Bavaria and were founding members of St. Mary's Church. The John Chopeks, however, were from Bohemia and could not understand the language of the St. Mary's Church services. So the Bishop of Davenport purchased land for a new Bohemian church in recognition of a need to serve this other ethnic group. Thus, St. Wenceslaus was born. This is not the first one, though, using bricks from the nearby Gollicher brickyard. This present-day church was built at the northwest corner of Davenport and Dodge Streets and displays a cornerstone with the year 1893. St. Wenceslaus was the martyred Duke of Bohemia in the AD 900s. By around 1900, pew rental fees were assessed to parishioners at both St. Mary's and St. Wenceslaus as a form of tithing, and this practice created some animosity. The nearby Zion Lutheran Church held services in German until the beginning of World War I, which led to the formation of Gloria Dei, known as the English Lutheran Church. The original Zion Lutheran Church was built at the corner of Bloomington and Johnson Streets, but was replaced there by the current one. Here's Bethlehem Chapel, which we find on Fairchild Street. It was apparently affiliated with the Congregational Church, which was also built in Goosetown. The front of the building has the sign Chapel 1888, and it's now a private residence. The small home at the northeast corner of Reno and Davenport Streets is described as, quote, the earliest school building remaining in Iowa City, and as a one-room district schoolhouse dating from before 1858. After ending its life as a private school, it became a Protestant chapel for a time, bearing the name of Bethlehem Chapel. Later in 1888, the brick one that I showed you replaced it. Upon incorporation in 1858, that's when Iowa City was incorporated, founded 1839, incorporated 1858, they created a public school system. The city was divided into wards. An elementary school shown here was built in the 3rd ward, and it was located right by the Prusel School in that park area that we have there now. Originally, there were 4 ward schools, and in the last decades of the 1800s, 2 other elementary schools were built. One of which was Kirkwood, which still exists. The building exists on the corner of Kirkwood and Dodge. And the other one is the first Shimmick, or North School, which is up here where Dodge and Governor split off. But these schools were all replaced in 1918 by the Longfellow School, the Mann School, the Sabin School, and one perhaps you haven't heard of, the Kellogg School. The Kellogg School was located in the area of where the VA hospital now sits. Around 1910, one of the 5 streetcar lines that were created in Iowa City came to Goosetown. And this map shows all 5 of the routes. And here's the one going up toward Goosetown, if you can see my wavy pointer, right here, going up Center Street. So the Goosetown run traveled between downtown, making its way along Bloomington Street, and then north to the end of Center Street. The Iowa City streetcars ran for only 20 years, from 1910 until 1930, when they were replaced by buses. The Krandic is an entirely different line. That was a different railroad system. Now I'd like to mention homes that are in Weber's depiction of Goosetown, the homes of today. Using his narrower boundaries of Goosetown, I toured the area, took some pictures of street scenes and buildings. Number of small homes typical of the early cottages still exist, but larger homes have replaced many of the smaller cottages. Here is a small home with the number 1880 on its front, presumably the year of being built. It's at 900 something Davenport Street. Here's another small one on Davenport. And this cottage at Reno and Davenport Streets. And this old barn that's on Reno Street. To help preserve their culture and bring fellow Bohemians together, it is said that this building, now a private residence, was once used as the Iowa City Czechoslovak Protective Society Hall, perhaps when the Iowa City group was organized in 1882. So that would have been a precursor to the one that's now the Prusel School. Many of the early cottages were built with limestone foundations because this stone was readily available from nearby quarries. One such house seems to have survived, only one. It's the 2-room Schindhelm Drew's cabin on Lucas Street, which was built in about 1854, soon after Christian Schindhelm moved from Germany. And you can see the addition to it attached to it on the right. And many of the Goosetown cottages and properties have lost their original look and character because of several things. First of all, the removal of picket fences that were common, and the house exteriors have been covered with aluminum and now vinyl siding. Let's talk about some familiar names in Iowa City of today, names which stem back to Goosetown. Many of you will find familiar names on this list of pioneer Goosetown families, and this is just a sampling of surnames with origins in Goosetown. The Alberhaski family has owned John's Grocery for over 70 years. Carl Chaddock, who lived to be 100 years old, ran a dirt and gravel business for years at a location which is now called Chaddock Green. It's where 4th Avenue and Friendship meet. And John Chopek, I showed you his picture earlier, was born in Bohemia in 1839. Bob Hibbs described him as a patriarch in Goosetown and said he led a group of 8 families to Goosetown in 1864. He spoke only broken English. He helped build the St. Wenceslaus Catholic Church. Now the name Roy Chopek, who died in World War I, and is, or at least was, the namesake for our Iowa City American Legion post, was John's grandson. The Englert name is associated with our local theater on Washington Street and an early ice business. And the next one, Harvett, Emma Harvett. Emma Harvett was born to Czech parents who came to town in 1854, and she lived from 1870 to 1949. She was a successful businesswoman who had ventures in Iowa City and other places and was able to retire at the age of 43. She became the first female mayor of Iowa City in 1922, when mayors were chosen by popular vote. And she was also the first female leader of a city in the United States with a population over 10,000. As mayor, one of Harvett's duties was to, quote, sit as judge of the city disturbances. The Iowa City Press Citizen printed this account of an incident. This is a quote. $10 in costs, Harvest crisply enunciated. Hell, woman, I ain't drunk, responded the man in front of her. $20 in costs, amended the mayor, after which the fellow capitulated. One more story about Emma. One author declared that although she often dressed severely, she wore a $2,000 2-carat diamond ring. Apparently a bootlegger in police court had paid his fine with the ring in lieu of cash. The ring was never reclaimed, and Harvett bought it from the city. Well, the diamond fell out of its setting while Emma was driving one day, and so she sent out all available police and firemen to search for it. The police chief eventually found it by a railroad track. And some of you may remember that in the year 2000, the city council chamber was designated as Emmett J. Harvett Hall. Her former home is on the corner of Gilbert and Davenport Streets. Jacob J. Hutz was one of many who cut ice before the days of refrigeration. Hutz Avenue was likely named for him or another family member. I've been told it's pronounced Hutz, as if with a U. Well, Hutz employed Goosetown men for many building projects, including the former county courthouse, St. Mary's School, which was torn down and is now Newman Center, the post office, the old Carnegie Library, the Solon Bank, and a number of prominent homes. The Hayek name is associated with Iowa City past and present attorneys. I may be mispronouncing and might be Hayek. We recognize the names Lennox and Seelig for the hardware stores and local realtor Mike Seelig. We think of Leppick Kreger Realtors, Lovetinsky Auto Repair, Pribble Plumbing and Heating, and Boyd and Rummelhart. There was Mayor Vevra and the Vitosh Standard Station. Bohumil Shimmick, naturalist, conservationist, and University of Iowa professor, lived from 1861 to 1937. Many things have been named for him. The present Shimmick School, the former North Shimmick Grade School on North Dodge, the Shimmick State Forest in southern Iowa. Interestingly, Shimmick graduated from the University of Iowa with a civil engineering degree, but he became noted for his study of natural history and as a professor of botany. Shimmick was involved in some fashion with the independence of Czechoslovakia, which was proclaimed in October of 1918. Well, that was actually just before Armistice Day then, as I said, about the war. His picture on the right reminds me of Milburn Stone, who played Doc Adams on Gunsmoke. One name not on this list was Weatherby, Isaac Weatherby. Not of Bohemian origin, lived from 1819 to 1904, and was a well-known painter and photographer. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and moved to Iowa City in 1858. He took the earliest pictures of the old Capitol in downtown Iowa City. He was one of the first persons to use the daguerreotype, an early form of photography. Here are some of the early images Weatherby made of Iowa City. Johnson County Fair was held on the old Capitol grounds in 1854. And here's Clinton Street in 1854. So why am I talking about Weatherby in the context of Goosetown? Well, he bought an 1854 home at 935 Market Street in 1860 and made an addition to it. That's on the edge of Goosetown. In 2007, the house was slated for demolition, but was saved by an effort spearheaded by our Mary Beth Sloniger. And in 2008, the house was moved to 611 North Governor Street, across from Oakland Cemetery. So both the original and later locations of this home are in Goosetown. Iowa City's Weatherby Park was named for Isaac in 1976. So in summary, today, Goosetown is made up of a mixture of rental properties and owner-occupied homes, a mixture of older people and younger people, and some gorgeous arching tree-lined streets. To some degree, I would consider Goosetown a trendy neighborhood. The proximity to the downtown and university makes for walkable access to these places. The street signs in the neighborhood that are topped by small metal placards depicting geese lend a nice touch for recognizing the historical significance of Goosetown. And with that, I thank you.